I had kept Adriel Kovar's books for 6 years, and in all that time, I had never once heard him lie. So when he stood in the long gallery at Thorncliffe, with a glass in his hand, and told the head of the Sarkis family that Linnea Voss was his future wife, I believed him. Every person in that room believed him. I was standing behind the half-open door, with a folder of doc manifests against my chest, close enough to hear the ice shift in his glass when he said her name. I did not scream. I did not walk in. I went back to my desk, finished the reconciliation, and began quietly planning how to leave. It took me 3 days to find out what that one sentence had actually cost him. By the end of them, a man I had trusted my whole adult life was dead, and the woman he named as his bride had known everything from the beginning. The gallery at Thorncliffe was 90 feet long and smelled of cold stone and hothouse lilies, and I hated it the way you hate a beautiful room you are only ever allowed to walk through on your way somewhere else. I had been sent up from the lower office with the harbor manifests, because Adriel had asked for them by hand, which meant he did not want them going through the house system. That was normal. Half of what I did for him never touched a screen. I came up the service stair with the folder under my arm, turned into the corridor behind the gallery, and stopped when I heard voices, because that was also normal. You did not walk into a room where Vaso Sarkis was speaking. You waited until somebody laughed. Nobody laughed. The door stood open by about the width of my hand. Through it I could see a slice of the room. The pale marble, the long table, with nothing on it, the tall windows going gray with weather. I could see Adriel from the shoulder down. Dark suit, no tie, one hand loose at his side, and the other holding a glass he had not drunk from. I knew he had not drunk from it because the ice was still stacked, instead of settled. 6 years teaches you to read a man from the parts of him you can see. Vaso Sarkis was speaking about the northern route, and about tariffs, and about the enormous consideration his family had shown in coming south at all, which is what men say when they mean they are owed something. He had a low, comfortable voice. He sounded like a man reading out the weather. Then he said, and I remember the exact shape of it, that piece between houses had always been written in one ink, and that his people would want to know whose name was going on the paper. There was a pause. It was not a long pause. That is the part I kept returning to afterward, at 2 and 3 in the morning, lying on my back in an apartment I could not afford to heat properly. It was not a long pause. He did not think about it. Adriel said Linnea Voss. The glass came up. The ice moved. My future wife, he said. The announcement goes out Friday. Her father will countersign. I remember that my first reaction was not pain. My first reaction was administrative. I thought, the Voss family holds neutral paper. There will be a countersignature requirement. I will need the treaty file from the vault before Friday, and Linnea will need to be briefed on the harbor schedule because she does not know a manifest from a menu. My second reaction arrived about 4 seconds later, and it went through me like cold water down the spine. Linnea Voss was my best friend. She had been my best friend since we were 19. She had a key to my apartment. She had sat on my kitchen floor eating cold noodles out of the carton. At midnight 3 weeks earlier, listening to me not talk about Adriel Kovar, which is a thing only a very good friend knows how to do properly. She had never once mentioned that she was being married into the family that employed me. I looked down at the folder in my hands. My thumb had gone white where it was pressed against the cardboard. Inside the room, Sarkis said something approving about the Voss name and about how a banker's daughter was a sensible choice in an unsentimental age. There was the sound of chairs. Somebody moved toward the door. I did not want to be found there. Not out of fear. I have stood in rooms with men who kill people for a living and asked them politely to move their feet so I could reach a filing drawer. It was something else. It was the specific, humiliating certainty that if Adriel came through that door and saw my face, he would know exactly what I had heard, and he would be kind about it, and I would not survive being handled kindly. So I turned around and went back down the service stair, with the manifest still under my arm, I put them on his desk myself an hour later, squared to the edge, when I knew for a fact that he was not in the room. My name is Cassia Marrow, and for 6 years, I was the least interesting person in the Kovar organization, which was the entire point of me. I was not muscle, and I was not family, and I was not decorative. I kept the ledgers. The real ones, the paper ones, the ones that lived in a fireproof cabinet in a windowless room on the second floor and never went near a network. I reconciled the harbor tariffs against the actual tonnage. I knew which harbor inspectors took cash, and which ones took a job for a nephew instead, and I knew that the second kind were more expensive over a 5-year horizon. And I had said so in a memo that Adriel had read twice and then locked in his own drawer. I was 31 years old. I owned 2 coats. I could tell you, without opening a file, what the Kovar family had paid in bribes, freight, legal retainers, and quiet compensation to widows in any given month going back 6 years. People underestimated me constantly, and it was the most useful thing about me. The story everyone in the house told about me was the one from the winter that the Halloran crew came up from the south to renegotiate. 9 of them in the front office, standing around like furniture, deliberately taking up space. Adriel was late on purpose, because being late was a message. And I walked through the middle of all 9 of them with a box of receipts, put it down, and asked the largest man in the room whether he would mind lifting his feet because I needed to get the chair out and the wheels caught on the rug. He lifted his feet. That story got told for years. It got told as a joke about how nothing frightened me. The truth was much duller. I had run the numbers on the Halloran crew that morning, and I knew their entire southern operation cleared less in a year than we spent on legal fees. And it is genuinely difficult to be afraid of a man once you have seen his balance sheet. That was my whole relationship with fear. I did not have courage. I had information. Adriel understood that about me before I understood it about myself. In my second year, he came down to the ledger room at some appalling hour, sat on the corner of the cabinet, and asked me to explain why I had flagged a shipping agent nobody else had looked at twice. I told him the man had changed his lunch. 6 years of the same place, on the same street. And then suddenly a different place, further away, more expensive, always alone. Adriel looked at me for a long moment, and then said, "You frighten me a little, Marrow," and left. The agent was arrested by the harbor authority 11 weeks later. Nobody in the house ever knew that I was the reason. That was the arrangement. I found the thing, he acted on it, and my name stayed off the paper. I preferred it that way. A name on paper is a name somebody can look up. So there is no version of this story where I am the woman everyone worries about. I was the one who noticed things. I was the one who stayed late. I was the one who knew how he took his coffee, and how long he could go without sleeping before he started making decisions, with his temper instead of his head, which was 4 days, and which I had personally prevented 11 times by putting a car in front of the house and telling the driver to say it was already booked. I had one other thing, which I did not tell anybody, and which I had arranged my entire life around concealing, but that comes later, and I am not ready to write it down yet. What I will say is this. I made a very good salary. Adriel paid me more than he paid men who carried guns, because he understood that a man with a gun can be replaced by another man with a gun, and there was nobody else alive who could reconstruct the harbor books from memory. And I lived in 3 rooms above a laundry on Halvard Row, with a radiator that worked when it wanted to, and I had not bought myself anything that was not food or a bus fare in 4 years. And every single person who knew me assumed I was simply careful with money. Linnea assumed it too. Linnea used to laugh about it. She used to say, I was going to die at 90. In that flat with a fortune under the floorboards. I let her think it. That is the thing I want to be honest about. Before any of the rest of it, nobody lied to me first. I had been lying by omission to everyone I loved for 6 years, and I had gotten so good at it that when somebody finally did the same thing to me, I did not recognize the technique. I gave myself the walk home to decide what kind of person I was going to be about it. It rained the whole way, the fine, sideways kind that gets in under a collar, and by the time I reached Halvard Row, I had built the entire case and closed it. Here is what I told myself. The Voss family held neutral paper. Linnea's father had signed treaties for 3 houses, and never once been asked to take a side, which made his daughter the single most politically valuable, unmarried woman in the city. Adriel needed peace with the Sarkis family before the winter contracts, or he lost the northern route, and losing the northern route meant losing about a fifth of everything. So he had made a trade, that was all. It was the correct decision. If he had come to me and laid it out, I would have run the numbers and told him to do exactly what he did, and I would have been right. The problem was not that he had done it. The problem was that I had spent all of that time believing there was a version of him that would have told me first, not because I thought he loved me. I want to be precise, because I was precise about it at the time, standing in the stairwell of my own building, with my hair dripping onto the concrete. I did not think Adriel Kovar was in love with me. I am not the woman that happens to. I thought I was the person he came to before he did anything that mattered, and I had built a great deal of my life on that, more than I had realized until the moment it turned out not to be true. He had not thought about it. That was the detail my mind kept picking up and putting down. There had been no pause. I let myself in. The flat was cold. I did not put the heating on, because it was the 22nd, and the heating came on the 25th, and I was not going to break a 6-year discipline over a feeling. I sat down at the kitchen table with my coat still on, and I did the only thing I have ever known how to do with pain, which is turn it into a task. I wrote out my notice. Then I wrote out a handover schedule, because whatever else was true, the Harbor books could not simply stop, and there were 4 accounts that would collapse inside a month if nobody understood the rotation. I gave it 3 weeks. I listed every inspector by name and habit. I noted which of the vault files were mislabeled and why. I made it good, because doing it badly would have felt like revenge. And I did not want to be the kind of woman who takes revenge on a filing system. At the bottom of the last page I wrote, for personal reasons, and sat looking at it until the words came apart. Then my phone lit up on the table. It was Linnea. It was a photograph of a menu card, cream stock, someone's handwriting across the top, and underneath it she had typed 4 words. They want an answer. I looked at that for a while too. And then I did the thing that turned out to be the mistake, or possibly the only correct decision I made that entire year. I did not answer her. I picked up my keys, went back out into the rain, and went to the one place in the city where the answer was written down. There is a room under Thorncliffe that most of the household does not know exists. The house was built by a shipping family 140 years ago, back when a man who moved cargo wanted somewhere to put things he did not want moved. Underneath the kitchens there is a stone undercroft with a barrel ceiling and a floor that sweats in warm weather, and at the far end of it, behind a door that was once a wine gate, the Kovar family keeps its paper, not the working files. Those live upstairs with me. The undercroft holds the founding paper, treaties, grants, territory lines drawn by men who have been dead for 60 years. The originals of every agreement the family has ever signed, because in our world a photocopy is worth nothing and a signature is worth a district. I had the key because somebody had to reconcile the treaty schedule against the tariff book every quarter, and Adriel had decided, in my 3rd year, that the somebody was me. He had handed me the key across his desk without ceremony, the way you hand somebody a pen. Emmerich Sallow had been standing by the window when he did it, and Emmerich had said, in that dry, affectionate way he had, that Adriel was putting the family's history in the hands of a woman who bought her coats at a chain store. I had liked Emmerich. I want that on the record before I write anything else about him. He had been at my interview. He had taught me which of the old men in the organization would take a direct question and which ones needed to be walked around the long way. On my first Christmas in the house, he had noticed that I had nowhere to be and had invented an errand that required me to be in a warm office with a plate of food for 4 hours. I had liked him enormously, and that is the part I have still not managed to put down properly. I went to the Undercroft that night because I needed the treaty file. That is what I told myself on the bus, and it was even partly true. If the Voss marriage was going through, then a rider was going to be attached to the standing agreement with the Sarkees family, and a rider changes the tariff schedule, and the tariff schedule was mine. I could not write a handover for a set of books that were about to be restructured. Professionally speaking, I had no choice. I was aware, sitting on that bus with rain running down the inside of the window, that this was the most elaborate lie I had ever told myself. I let it stand anyway. Sometimes the lie is the only thing that gets you onto the bus. Thorncliffe at night was a different building. The public rooms went dark at 11, and the security detail moved to the gates, and what was left was a very large, very cold house with 2 men in it and a lot of marble. I came in through the kitchen entrance because I always did, and signed the book on the wall by the pantry because everyone did, and that was where the evening stopped being about my feelings. The access log is a ledger like any other. Date, time, name, destination. It is kept by hand because Adriel does not trust a system that can be edited from somewhere else, which is an instinct I had always privately admired and was about to become extremely grateful for. I signed my name, and then, out of pure habit, because I cannot look at a column of entries without reading it, I ran my eye up the page. And there I was, 14 days earlier, 11 at night, Cassia Marrow, Undercroft. I had been in the Northern office, 14 days earlier. I had been there for 3 days, with Milo Fenn driving, sleeping in a hotel that smelled of chlorine, reconciling a warehouse that had been robbing us for a year. There were 7 people who could confirm it, and one of them was Adriel. I stood in that cold kitchen corridor with the pen still in my hand, and read my own name in handwriting that was not mine, and I felt the entire evening turn over underneath me like a boat. Whoever had written it had been careful. They had matched the slant, they had used the same kind of pen. They had even put a small hook on the final letter of Marrow, which I do, because a woman who signs her name 40 times a day develops a flourish whether she wants one or not. They had gotten it very nearly right, and they had gotten it wrong in exactly one way. They had written my first name in full. I have never once, in 6 years, signed that book with anything but an initial. It takes less time. Everybody who has ever watched me do it knows that, which meant that the person who forged my entry had never actually watched me do it. They had only ever seen my name finished. I put the pen down very carefully, the way you put something down when your hands have started to shake, and you would rather they did not. To reach the stair you go through the old service passage behind the dining room, and the dining room doors were standing open. They had started already. 2 long tables had been brought in and pushed together, and the surface was covered in the machinery of an announcement. Sample cards in 3 shades of cream, a box of ribbon. Somebody had laid out place settings for a party that was still 11 days away, and had left them there half-finished, 4 settings perfect, and the 5th abandoned mid-arrangement, as though whoever it was had been called out of the room, and had not come back. Propped against a candlestick was a printed card with the family crest at the top, and 2 names underneath in a script, so fine you had to lean in to read it. I did not lean in, I already knew both names. There was a florist's estimate lying next to it. I read the total upside down out of pure reflex, and thought, without any feeling at all, that they were being overcharged by about 1/3 on the imported stock, and that I should say something to somebody, and then remembered that I had written my notice 90 minutes ago and was standing in a house I had already decided to leave. That was the moment the anger arrived. Not in the gallery, not on the bus. Standing in an empty dining room at midnight doing sums on a flower bill for a wedding I was not invited to. I turned off the passage light behind me, which I do without deciding to, and went down. The stair down to the undercroft is stone and it turns twice. And there is no light on the turns because the sconces were wired in the 1950s, and half of them have never worked since. The wall on the left is cold enough that you can feel it before you touch it. The wall on the right sweats. There is a particular sound that stone makes under a shoe, a kind of gritty complaint, and I had always liked it, and that night, every single step of it sounded like an announcement of where I was. I went down slowly, not out of fear, out of arithmetic. Because there were only 4 keys to that door. Adriel had one, Emmerich had one. There was one in the safe in the study that had not moved since before I was hired. And I had the 4th, and it had been in my coat pocket in a hotel that smelled of chlorine, 200 miles north, on the night that somebody had signed my name and walked down these stairs. I want to explain what that felt like, and I am not sure I can do it honestly, because the honest version is unflattering. It did not feel like danger. It felt like being robbed. 6 years I had spent making myself into the person who could not be gotten around, not the strongest person in the organization, not the most feared, not the most loved, the most necessary. The one you could not root past, because the paper went through me and only through me, and I had built that deliberately, brick by brick, the way another woman might build a savings account or a marriage. And somebody had simply walked around me, in my own handwriting, wearing my own name. I reached the bottom of the stair and stopped, because the undercroft was warm. Not warm, warmer. The undercroft holds one temperature all year, the temperature of stone and standing air, and it is the temperature of a church in February. But there was a difference in it, the faint, stale difference a room has when a body has been in it recently. And under the smell of damp and old paper, there was something else that did not belong. Cigar smoke. Very faint. Days old, maybe a week. Emmerich Sallow smoked 1 cigar a night and had done for 30 years. And for as long as I had worked in that house, the smell had meant somebody kind had just walked in. I stood at the bottom of that stair in the dark for longer than I would like to write down. Then I went to the wine gate, put my key in the lock, and found that it turned too easily, because the door was already unlocked. The treaty file was where it should have been. That was the first thing, and it steadied me, because a room that has been robbed announces itself, and this room had not been robbed. The founding paper sat in its boxes in date order. The territory grants were in their sleeves. There was dust on the top of the cabinet, and the dust was undisturbed, and for about 90 seconds, I entertained the very attractive theory that I had misread a log entry and imagined a smell. Then I opened the standing agreement with the Sarkis family, and the writer was already in it. Not drafted, not pending. Executed, in the sense that our world means it, which is to say, 2 men had initialed the margin, and one of them was Vaso Sarkis and the other was not Adriel Kovar. I lowered myself onto the stone step by the cabinet with the file open on my knees and read it 4 times. The language was old-fashioned and very calm, the way that paper always is when it is arranging something terrible. It said that peace between the northern and southern interests would be affirmed by marriage. It said that the affirming party would nominate a bride, and that the nomination would be delivered in writing before the end of the week. And then it said, in a subclause that ran 2 lines and would have looked like housekeeping to anybody who did not read paper for a living, that in the event the peace failed, the nominated party would be considered the property of the injured house. I read that subclause more times than the rest of it put together. The nominated party, not the family, not the estate, the woman, whoever Adriel named, was not being married. She was being posted as collateral. And any house that wants a war can arrange a failure of peace, and any man who has already been paid by the other side can arrange it in an afternoon. I made myself do the thing I do, because it was the only thing standing between me and the stairs. I went through it as paper. Who benefits? Who drafted? Who witnessed? The drafting hand was a lawyer in the north, which meant nothing. The witness line was blank, which meant a great deal, because a rider, to a founding agreement with no witness, is a document that somebody intends to be able to disown. and the initials in the margin were the ones that would not stop bothering me. Because Vasosarkis had signed like a man signing a lease, all his letters finished, and the other set was small and pressed hard and had been made by someone whose hand had shaken on the second stroke. I knew that hand. I had watched that hand write checks for my expenses. And there was a date at the foot of the page, and the date was the 10th, and on the 10th of that month, Adriel Kovar had been in the northern office with me, standing in a warehouse in the rain, arguing with an inventory clerk about pallet counts. He had not signed this. He had not been in the same part of the country as this. Something in my chest that had been extremely busy since the gallery went completely quiet. The way a room goes quiet when the machinery finally stops. Underneath the writer, there was a second folder that I had never seen in my life. It was not a house folder. It was the cheap kind, the kind you buy in a packet, and there was no label on it, and it had been slid into the back of the treaty box, where a person reconciling a tariff schedule would have no reason to go. I opened it. It was a list in Adriel's handwriting, which I would know at the bottom of the sea. 9 names, every unmarried woman in the city, with any connection to the Kovar family, written out with a note beside each one. What house she was protected by, what her father traded in, what it would cost to keep her alive if the peace broke. 8 of the 9 were crossed out with a single line. My name was at the top. My name was not crossed out with a single line. My name had been gone over so many times that the pen had torn through the paper, and around the tier the page had buckled, where something had been spilled on it and dried. Under the list, in the same hand, 3 words: not her, anything. I sat on that cold step, with the folder open, and understood, all at once and far too late, that there had been no pause in the gallery, because he had done all of his thinking weeks earlier, alone, in a room under his own house, with a pen he was pressing hard enough to break. And then I understood the other thing. The thing that arrived a half-second behind it and went through me much colder. He had crossed my name out, to keep me off that paper. He had put Linnea on it instead. Linnea, who had a key to my apartment. Linnea, who had eaten noodles on my kitchen floor. And let me not talk about him. He had not saved me from anything. He had chosen which of us to spend. I have replayed that thought more times than any other in my life, and I have never entirely forgiven myself for how fast it came, or for how good it felt to have it. There is a particular relief in deciding that the person who hurt you is simply worse than you thought. It closes the file. It lets you stand up. I stood up. I put the folder inside my coat, against my ribs, where it sat cold and flat and slightly too large, and I closed the treaty box, and I squared it to the edge of the shelf, because apparently, I would do that at the end of the world. I remember thinking with complete clarity that I was going to walk out of that undercroft, get on the last bus, and be on a train before the announcement went out. I was going to leave the notice on his desk with the handover schedule attached, and let him find out from paper the way I had found out from a door. And I remember one thought, underneath that one, small and disloyal, and refusing to be quiet, which was that a man who had gone over a name so many times he tore the page had not been making a calculation. I had had enough revelations for one night. I was still holding the edge of my coat, closed over the folder, when I heard the stair door open at the top of the flight, and a man's footsteps start down toward me in the dark. I did not hide. There was nowhere to go, and I had a folder inside my coat, and I was, I think, past the point where hiding would have felt like anything except one more small humiliation in a night that had already run long. So I stayed where I was, on the stone step, with my hands in my lap, and I watched the dark at the bottom of the stair. Adriel came around the second turn and stopped. He was wearing the same shirt he had worn in the gallery, and it had been a good shirt at 7 in the evening, and it was not one now. His collar was open, his sleeves were pushed up past the elbow. There was a stripe of dust across one forearm that he had not noticed, and his right hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth that had been white at some point in its life and had been tied by somebody who had never tied one before, which is to say by himself. The knuckles under it were swollen enough to change the shape of his hand. He looked at me. Then he looked at the open treaty box, and at the cheap folder that was not in the treaty box anymore, and I watched him do the arithmetic, and I watched him arrive. I had been in rooms with this man while he was told about deaths, arrests, seizures, betrayals, and a fire that took a warehouse and 2 of his people with it. And I had never once seen him do anything with his face. He did something with his face. It lasted about a second and a half. Then he crossed the undercroft, and I braced for whatever a man like that does when you have your hands on the worst thing he owns. He put his back against the wall opposite me and slid down it until he was sitting on the floor, not on the step, on the floor, on the cold sweating stone of a cellar, in a house with 40 rooms in it, with his forearms across his knees and his ruined hand hanging loose, looking up at me, because I was on the step and he was lower. Nobody in the organization had seen Adriel Kovar sit on a floor. I am reasonably confident nobody ever had. How long have you had it? He said. About 9 minutes. He nodded slowly, as though 9 minutes were a figure that could be worked with. Did you read the subclause? I read the subclause 4 times. Then you know, he said, that I have been trying to work out for 3 weeks how to tell you something I could not tell you. And then he did not say anything else, and neither did I, and we sat in that cellar in the dark, with a torn piece of paper between us. I did not offer him anything. I want to be clear about that, because I have heard the story told back to me since, with a great deal of warmth in it, and there was no warmth in that room. What I did was hold up the folder and say, "Explain this to me the way you would explain it to somebody you were about to fire." He almost smiled. It did not get anywhere near his eyes. "All right," he said. He talked for a long time. "I am going to set it down in order, which is not the order it came out in, because it came out sideways, in pieces, the way a thing does when a man has been carrying it alone and has stopped being able to feel the shape of it." The writer had not come from him. It had come to him. 3 weeks earlier, Emmerich Sallow had walked into the study with a document already initialed in the margin and set it on the desk and said, "This is what the North wants, and I have had a hard enough time getting them down to this." Sarkis had wanted the northern route surrendered outright. Emmerich had, apparently, argued him back from that. Emmerich had come home with a marriage clause instead and had presented it the way a man presents a rescue. And I was grateful to him, Adriel said. For about 4 days, I was grateful to him. The collateral subclause was not something Emmerich had drawn attention to. It sat in the middle of the 3rd paragraph in the language of housekeeping. And it did what those clauses always do, which is sit quietly until somebody wants to use it. Adriel had found it on the 4th day, at 2 in the morning, reading the thing for the 9th time, because something about the shape of it had been bothering him, and he could not say what. "I have never been the cleverest person in this house," he said. "I read paper the way a man reads a language he learned late, slowly and out loud and 4 times. "That is not true," I said. "It is completely true, and both of us have known it for 6 years. And the only reason it has never cost me anything is that I hired somebody who reads it the way you read a face." I did not have an answer to that, so I did not give one. What he had understood on the 4th day was the thing I had understood on the stone step, that a nomination is a target, that the clause did not create peace, it created a hostage, and that whoever he named would be alive exactly as long as the North found the peace convenient. And a peace can be made inconvenient by anybody. It takes one truck stopped at a line, it takes one body in a river, so I did not need a bride, he said. I needed a name that clause could not reach. He had spent the following week finding out that there was no such name. That was the list, 9 women. He had gone through every family connected to the Kovar interest and worked out, one at a time, what would happen to each of them if the peace failed on a Tuesday. 8 of them were protected by houses that would object, and then accept compensation, because that is what houses do. The 9th was Linnea Voss, whose father had signed treaty paper for 3 separate houses across 20 years, and had never once taken a side, and whose neutrality was written into agreements that 4 organizations in that city were obliged to enforce. If Faso Sarkis ever laid a hand on a Voss daughter, he would not be fighting the Kovar family. He would be fighting everyone who had ever needed a neutral signature, which in our world is everyone. Naming Linnea did not make the clause dangerous. Naming Linnea made the clause worthless. It was the only move on the board, Adriel said. And I hated it, and I took it. I sat with that. Then I said, and me. He looked at the floor. You were at the top of that list, I said. You wrote my name first, before you wrote hers, before you wrote any of them. Yes? Why? Because you were the first name I thought of, he said, which is the answer to a different question than the one you are asking, and I would rather answer the one you are asking. He turned his hand over on his knee and winced, and did not stop. You have nothing, he said. No house, no paper, no father, in a trade with anybody. Your mother lives in a rented flat in a town 2 hours from here, under a name that is not hers, which you arranged, and which I have never once mentioned to you until this minute. If I put your name on that rider, there is no organization in this country that would have been obliged to lift a finger for you. Sarkis could have collected you off a bus. The cold in that cellar got into me all at once. I realized my coat was still soaked through from the walk, and that I had been shaking for some time without registering it. He saw it. He got up off the floor, took his own coat off the hook by the wine gate, where he had evidently left it hours earlier, and held it out. I do not want it, I said. I am aware. He kept holding it out. After a while, I took it, because I was cold, and because refusing warmth to prove a point is the sort of thing I have spent my life doing, and I was tired. Your hand, I said. It is fine. It is not fine. It is the wrong shape, and you have tied that with a strip off a dust sheet, which is going to be a problem in about a day. There was a first aid tin bolted to the wall by the gate, because there is one in every room in that house, and it had not been opened in years. I got it down. I made him sit on the step, and I unwrapped his hand under the one working light, and it was a mess, and neither of us said anything about how it had gotten that way, and I did not ask, and he did not tell me, and we both knew it had happened somewhere between the gallery and midnight. I strapped the 2 fingers together and wound it properly, and while I did it he kept talking, because it was easier to talk to someone who is looking at his hand than at his face. There is a leak, he said. I have known for 2 months. Not a guess. Sarkis has come into 3 separate negotiations, knowing our ceiling before we set it. That does not happen by accident, and it does not happen from the outside. It is somebody with the paper. There are 4 keys to this room. There are 4 keys to this room, he agreed. I finished the wrap and taped it off and did not let go of his hand. Say the rest of it, I said. He said it. One of the 4 is yours. I have thought about how to write down what happened in my chest at that moment, and the best I can manage is that it did not break. It went somewhere. It went the way a floor goes when the water is high enough underneath it. You thought it was me? No, Adriel. I did not think it was you, he said, and he finally looked up. I could not prove it was not you. Those are not the same thing, and I have been living in the space between them for 2 months, and it has been the worst 2 months of my life. He took his hand back, carefully, and put it in his lap. Emeric came to me 19 days ago, with 6 years of your accounts. The Undercroft went very quiet. He had your salary, Adriel said. He had what you pay in rent, which is nothing. He had what you spend, which is nothing. And he had a transfer going out of your account on the 29th of every month for 6 years, to an account he could not trace, for an amount that goes up every time I give you a raise. He said it without any inflection at all, the way you read out a charge. He put it in front of me and he said, this is a woman being paid by somebody else, and she is putting it somewhere she does not want you to see, and Adriel, I love you, but you have given her the key to the founding paper, and you said. I said, Get out of my office. And then I sat there for 4 hours, he said, and I could not make the numbers say anything else. I let go of the first aid tin. I heard it hit the stone. You could have asked me. I could not ask you, he said. That is the entire point. If I ask you, and you are the leak, you know I know and you tell them and I lose the only advantage I have. If I ask you and you are not the leak, then I have told the one person in my life whose bad opinion I have never learned how to survive, that I sat in a room and considered it. Either way, I lose you. So I did not ask, and I put a nomination on a piece of paper without telling you first. And I have known for 11 days that when you found out you would leave, and I let it happen anyway, because it was the only version where you were alive at the end of the week. I want to record exactly what I did next, because it was not brave and it was not clever. I laughed. It came out wrong, high and short, and it echoed off the barrel ceiling and came back at us twice. 6 years, I said. Cassia. 6 years, and you sat in a room and did the arithmetic and could not make it come out. No, he said. Look at me. I could not make it come out. That is what I am telling you. Every single number Emmerich put on that desk was true. All of it. He did not invent one figure. And he was right. And I was the only person alive who could explain why. And I had spent every year since making absolutely certain that I never would. So I stayed where I was, on the step, in his coat, in a cellar, at some hour of the morning I could never afterward pin down, and I told him about my father. Tobin Marrow drove for the Kovar family for 19 years, and he was not a good man, and he was not a bad one. He was a man who was very fond of me, and very fond of an evening, and in his last 2 years he was moving money for the harbor office, and in his last 8 months he took some of it. Not a great deal. 41,000, taken in 11 separate pieces across those 8 months, in amounts small enough that a busy office would call it float error. Then he drove into the water off the coast road on a wet night in the November before I was hired, and the office did what offices do at a funeral, which is nothing, and the 11 small errors sat in a book that nobody was reconciling because the man who reconciled it was dead. I found it in my 2nd month, I said. It was the first book I was given. It was my father's book. He left it for me to find, and I do not think for 1 second that he meant to. Adriel did not say anything. I could have told you. You would probably have written it off. You were 29 years old, you had just buried your own father, and you would have waved a hand at 41,000 to look generous in front of the old men. I would have, he said. I know. That is why I did not tell you. Because a debt that is forgiven is a debt that somebody remembers. Because the old men in that organization would have known inside a week that the new bookkeeper was the daughter of a man who stole, and that the boss had let it go because he was soft on her. Because everything I would build afterward, every audit, every flagged inspector, every time I put my name to a number, would have had that sitting underneath it. And because there was a woman in a rented flat 2 hours from here who had been married to Tobin Marrow for 34 years and had known nothing about any of it, and who would have had to know, so I paid it back, I said. The 29th of the month, every month. Into a suspense account inside the harbor office that I opened, that I control, that reconciles to 0 at every quarter end, because I reconcile it, sitting inside the very books Emmerich was showing him as evidence. 6 years, I said. I finish in March. There is 4,100 left. I heard him breathe out. You have been paying my family, he said slowly, back into my own accounts. Out of the salary I pay you. For 6 years. Yes, and Emmerich found the outflow, and could not find the inflow, because the inflow is inside a suspense line, in a book only you read. Yes. And if the piece had broken, Adriel said, and somebody had gone looking for who sold this family to the north, they would have found a log entry in your handwriting in this room, on a night you were 200 miles away, and a woman with no house behind her who has been moving money out of her account every month for 6 years. Something in my ears was ringing. He was not going to sell you and blame nobody, I said. He was going to sell you and blame me. Yes. That is why my name is at the top of your list. No, Adriel said. Your name is at the top of my list, because I sat down to write out every woman in this city whose life I would be signing away. And yours arrived before I had put the pen on the paper, and I have not had a clean thought since. I looked at the folder on the step between us. Not her. Anything. You knew I was behind that door, I said. He did not answer. In the gallery. You knew. I saw the light change on the floor when the door moved, he said. I have known the sound of your shoes in that corridor for 6 years. You said it anyway. I said it because you were behind the door, he said. Because if you had walked in there and heard nothing, you would have taken that writer apart in an afternoon and gone to Emmerich with a question. The way you go to people with questions, and he would have had you off a bridge inside a week. I needed you angry with me, and I needed you leaving, and I needed you looking exactly like a woman who had been passed over, because that is the only thing that was going to keep you boring enough to survive until I found him. He rubbed his face with his good hand. It was the worst thing I have ever done to anybody, he said, and I would do it again tomorrow, and you should know that about me before you decide anything. I sat down again, because standing had stopped being an option. There is a thing that happens when you have been in pain for a number of hours over one specific idea, and then somebody removes the idea, and the pain does not go anywhere. It has nowhere to be, it just stands about in your chest like a delivery nobody signed for. You could have written it down, I said. One line, anything. You could have put a note in the tariff book. I am the only person who opens the tariff book. I thought about it for 2 days, and on the second day, I worked out that if I was wrong about you, a note in the tariff book was a signed confession that I knew, and it would have gone north inside a day. He said it without any defense in it at all. I am not going to stand here and tell you it was the only option. It was the option I could see. I have been making decisions on 4 hours of sleep, in a house where I could not name one person I was certain of, and I got a great many of them wrong. And the one I am sorriest about is the one where I made you stand behind a door and listen to me say somebody else's name. You are not sorry you did it. No, he said. I am sorry that it worked. There is a telephone in the Undercroft. It is a house line, black, mounted on the wall by the gate. And it is there because, in 1960-something, a man wanted to be able to call up from the paper room without carrying anything up 2 flights. Adriel got up and took it off the hook. What are you doing, ending it? It is 3:15 in the morning. He is awake, Adriel said. Men like Vasosarkis sleep extremely well right up until the week they get what they asked for. He dialed. It rang and rang. I stood up because I could not sit for it. When it connected, he did not identify himself. Withdraw the rider, he said. I could hear a voice on the other end. Not the words, just the shape of it, low and unhurried, a man being reasonable at 3 in the morning, because being reasonable costs him nothing. I am aware of what I agreed to, Adriel said. I am telling you that the 3rd paragraph is not going to exist by Friday, and that there will be no nomination, and that if you would like the northern route, you are welcome to come and take it in the ordinary way, like a man, instead of buying a clause off my godfather and calling it a wedding. The shape of the voice changed. No, Adriel said, there is no bride. There is not going to be a bride. Nobody is going to be standing on that paper where you can reach her. He listened for perhaps 10 seconds. Then we are at war on Friday, he said. And before you spend anything else on it, you should have somebody read you the document you bought. Look at the witness line. Look at the date. You have paid a great deal of money for a piece of paper that has never at any point been worth the ink. He hung up. He did it quietly. He set the handset back on the cradle with more care than he had used on anything else that night. Then he stood facing the wall for a moment, with his bandaged hand flat against the stone. That was about 1/5 of everything, he said. Closer to 1/4 if you count the freight rebates. Thank you. Anytime. He turned around. Whatever was in his face then was not relief. It was the specific, hollowed-out look of a man who has just spent something he cannot get back and is waiting to find out what it bought. I found that my hands were perfectly steady for the first time in 5 hours. Right, I said. Then we have until Friday to destroy Emmerich Sallow on paper. And I am going to need the logbook off the kitchen wall, both keys you can get to, and something to eat, because I have not had anything since 1 o'clock yesterday, and I am about to be very useful to you. Linnea was waiting in my flat when I finally got home at 6:30, sitting on the floor with her back against the radiator that does not work still, in the coat she had worn to dinner. She had let herself in. She had a key? That was the entire problem with Linnea Voss. She looked up. She did not say, "Hello." "He told you," she said. "Some of it. I work the rest out myself, which you should have expected. I wanted to tell you." Her voice did that thing it does when she is not going to cry, and is going to sound like it for an hour. "Cassia, I have wanted to tell you for 11 days. I have sat in this flat and eaten your terrible noodles and let you talk about nothing. You volunteered." Of course I volunteered. She said it like I had asked her whether she had taken a coat in the rain. "He came to my father," she said. "He came to my father and he laid the thing out. All of it, including the part where he had spent a week trying to find a name that was not yours. And my father said no. My father said no for about 4 hours. And then I said the sentence that ended the argument, which was that I am the only woman in this city that clause cannot touch, and that if I am not standing on it, somebody else is." She pulled her knees up. "And I knew who the somebody else was," she said. "Do not make me say it out loud." I sat down on the floor next to her, which took a while, because my legs had stopped being reliable somewhere around 4 in the morning. "You could have been killed," I said. "No," said Linnea Voss. "And that is the entire point of me, and it is the first time in my whole useless life that being nobody's daughter but my father's has been worth anything at all." We sat there against the cold radiator, in our coats, in the gray light. Two women who had each spent years politely not telling the other one the largest fact of her life. "For the record," she said eventually, "I would have made a magnificent mafia wife. You do not know a manifest from a menu." "I know a menu," she said, "extremely well," and then she put her head on my shoulder, and neither of us said anything else for a while. I went back to Thorncliffe at noon, and I did not make it to the second floor. I got as far as the bottom of the main stair, which I remember, and then there is a gap, and then I was sitting on the third step with my head between my knees and somebody's hand flat between my shoulder blades telling me to keep breathing out for longer than I breathed in. The hand belonged to Milo Fenn. Milo had driven me 200 miles north and back and had never once asked me a personal question in all that time, and he sat on that step with me for 4 minutes without saying anything except that, and then he went and got the doctor, and I have never properly thanked him for either. Dr. Perrin was a small, unimpressed woman in her 60s who had been patching that family up since before I was born and who spoke to everybody, including Adriel, as though they had personally wasted her afternoon. She took me into the morning room and shut the door and did all the ordinary things. Then she sat back on the arm of a chair and looked at me for slightly too long. "How long have you been dizzy on stairs?" she said a while. "Give me a number." "About a year." "Right," she said. She began to tick things off on her fingers, and she did it flatly, the way you read out an inventory of damage after a storm. The results of my last house medical, which she had written to somebody about twice, and which nobody had read, blood pressure, which she described as the pressure of a woman who stands up too fast for a living. Hands, which she took and turned over and looked at the nails of, and put down again without comment, which was worse than a comment. Iron, which she said she did not need a laboratory to have an opinion about. Sleep, which I told her honestly was around 5 hours, and which she said was a very confident answer from somebody who had just fainted in a hallway. And the cold, she said. "You are not heating that flat. We are going to fix the sleep, and the meals, and the heating. in that order. And you are going to let somebody help you do it. I heed it. From the 25th. Perrin put her pen down. Miss Marrow, she said, there is nothing here I cannot put right, and all of it is going to take a great deal longer than it should. What you have is 6 years of a person deciding every single day that she comes last. There is no injury. That is what makes it difficult. There is nothing to stitch, so there is nothing to point at, and so nobody points at it. The door was not properly shut. I found that out afterward. I do not know how much of it he heard. I know that when I came out, he was standing at the far end of the corridor with his back to me, and his bandaged hand braced against the window frame, and that he did not turn around straight away, and that when he did, his face was completely composed in the way that a room is completely tidy an hour after something has been thrown across it. He did not say a word about any of it, not then, not for 2 days. What he did was this. At some point that afternoon, a delivery arrived at Halvard Row, and a man from a heating company spent 3 hours in my flat and left. And when I got home at midnight, the radiator was working, and there was a receipt on the table, with no note attached to it. And the account it had been billed to was a suspense line inside the harbor office that reconciles to 0 at every quarter end. He had paid for it out of my father's account, with my own money. Which is the only version I would have accepted, and he knew that, and it took me until the following spring to forgive him for how well he understood me. You are going to the coast, he said. This was the study, 4 o'clock, with the war starting on Friday, and the whole house moving underneath us like an engine coming up to speed. No. Milo takes you at 6. There is a house. It is quiet. It is not in any of our paper. And Perrin has already agreed to come out on Sunday. No, Cassia. You have, until Friday, to take a man apart, who has been inside this family for 30 years, I said. And the only weapon you have is a document, and there is exactly one person in this building who can read it. So, no. He came around the desk. He knows you found the folder. He does not. He will by tonight, Adriel said. The wine gate was unlocked because he has stopped bothering to lock it. He will go down, and he will find his folder gone, and he will see that the treaty box has been squared to the edge of the shelf, which nobody in this house does, except you, and he will know inside 4 seconds. That landed. I had not thought of it, and he had, and it was the first time he had ever beaten me to something on paper, and I was so annoyed that I actually stood up. Then he will come here, I said, where there are 9 men on the gates. Rather than me being in a house on the coast that nobody knows about, with 1 driver, for 4 days, at the end of which you will have lost, because you will have gone into that gallery on Friday, holding a piece of paper you cannot read out. I am trying to keep you alive. You are trying to put me somewhere, I said, and my voice came out much louder than I meant it to, and it rang off all that marble. That is not the same thing. You have been trying to put me somewhere for 3 weeks. You put me outside the rider, you put me behind a door in a gallery, you put me in a story where I am angry with you, and packing, and every single time it was for a good reason, and every single time you did it without me, because you have nothing behind you. I have never had anything behind me. I have had me. That is the whole of it. That is all there has ever been, and you are the only person alive who has ever treated that as though it were enough. And now you have changed your mind about it, and I would rather you had put my name on the rider. I got about halfway through the last word before my legs went. It was not dramatic. It was the same thing that had happened on the stair, a sort of soft folding, and he caught me somewhere around the elbows, and I ended up with both hands flat against his chest, and my forehead more or less on his collarbone, which is where I discovered that I was crying, which was news to me. 6 years. 6 years of standing on the other side of a desk. In all that time, the closest we had ever been was the width of a document he was signing. He did not say anything soothing. I do not think he knew any. He stood there with his good hand between my shoulder blades and let me be furious against his shirt. And after a while he said, in a completely ordinary voice. "It is not that I think you cannot do it." "Then what?" "It is that I have got very used to you being in the building," he said, "and I do not think I would manage the other thing." I stepped back. I dried my face with the heel of my hand in a manner that I am confident was not attractive. "Fine," I said. "Then sit down and let me show you how we end him, because it is not going to be with the 9 men on the gate." I put the rider on the desk and turned it around so it faced him. "There are 3 things wrong with this document," I said, "and any one of them is fatal. And all 3 of them were made by the same man in the same 20 minutes. The witness line was blank. A rider to a founding agreement is void on its face without a witness, and every one of the old men who would be standing in that gallery on Friday had grown up under that rule and would not need it explained. The date at the foot was the 10th, and on the 10th Adriel Kovar had been standing in a warehouse 200 miles north with an inventory clerk and 11 other witnesses, which meant the initials in the margin had been made by a man representing that he held an authority he did not hold on a day it could be proved he was not authorized. And the third thing was in the kitchen, screwed to the wall, in a book nobody had thought about in 30 years. "He wrote my first name out in full," I said. "He has watched me sign that book 1,000 times, and he has never once looked, because he has never once thought that what I was doing mattered. That is not a forgery. That is a man who cannot see me writing down a woman he has never actually looked at." Adriel sat back in his chair and looked at the 3 of them laid out. "He built the whole thing on you being invisible," he said. "Yes. And the only reason it fails is that he never checked." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to read it out," he said. "On Friday in front of all of them. Not me. They will not listen to me." "They will listen to you," Adriel said, "because I am going to be standing behind you, and because by the end of it, they are going to understand that the only reason any of them still has a business is that a woman they have walked past for 6 years reads more carefully than they do." Friday, 11 in the morning, the long gallery at Thorncliffe. They had taken the tables out of the dining room and put the chairs in a horseshoe, and every old man in the Southern interest was in that room, and Vaso Sarkis had come down with 4 of his people because he had been invited, which had been my idea and which Adriel had disliked for 2 days. Emeric Salo arrived last, which he always did, and he came in smiling because he did not know yet, and because 30 years of walking into rooms where everybody was pleased to see him had left him without the equipment to imagine one where they were not. He sat down. He crossed his legs. He looked over at me standing by the window with a folder against my chest, and he gave me the small, warm, encouraging nod he had been giving me since my interview. I have carried that nod around ever since. Adriel did not make a speech. He said that a writer had been added to the standing agreement without his signature, that he had withdrawn it on Tuesday night, and that before anybody in the room decided how they felt about that, they were going to hear the document read properly, and that the person who was going to read it was the person who kept the family's books. Then he stood behind my right shoulder and stopped talking. I read it out, all of it, slowly, including the 3rd paragraph, and I watched what the 3rd paragraph did to the room, because most of those men had daughters. Then I read the witness line, which was empty. Then I read the date, and I said where Adriel Kovar had been on that date, and I named the inventory clerk, and the hotel, and Milo Fenn, who put his hand up at the back of the room without being asked to. And then I put the writer down, and I picked up the access log off the kitchen wall, and I said that on the night in question the paper room had been opened by a person who had signed my name. I held it up. "That is not my signature," I said. "In 6 years, I have never written my first name in that book. It takes too long." The room went absolutely silent. Emeric did not move. I will give him that much. He sat in his chair with his legs crossed, while every man in that gallery worked it out, and what finally broke on his face was not fear, and it was not shame. It was irritation. That is the thing I have never got past. He was not frightened of being caught. He was annoyed at what had caught him. He uncrossed his legs. He looked around the horseshoe of chairs, at men he had known for 40 years, and he did the thing I had watched him do 100 times in that house, which was to pick the friendliest face in the room and speak only to it. "You have all met her," he said. 6 years. Not one of you could tell me her father's name. Nobody answered him. That was the first moment I understood that it was already finished. "Tobin Marrow," said Adriel from behind my shoulder. "Drove for my father for 19 years. Took 41,000 out of the harbor float in his last 8 months, and died before anybody found it. His daughter has been paying it back into this family's accounts on the 29th of every month since the week she was hired, out of her own salary. And she finishes in March, and there is not one man in this room who would have done the same." I had not known he was going to say that. We had not discussed it. I had, in fact, specifically not discussed it, and I stood there, in front of 30 people, with my ears going hot, and understood that he had chosen to spend the one secret I had left on making absolutely certain that nobody in that gallery ever looked past me again. "You were going to hang it on her," said one of the old men, from somewhere behind me in a voice like a door, closing. Emmerich looked up, and he looked at me, and for the first time in 6 years he actually did. "She was available," he said. Adriel did not touch him. Nobody in that gallery touched him. What happened was quieter and much worse, and it took about 90 seconds, and it happened because I had insisted on the invitation. Adriel turned to Vaso Sarkis, who had sat through the entire reading without a flicker, and said that the Northern House had paid a very large amount of money for a document that had never at any point been enforceable, and that he assumed a man of Sarkis' standing would want to take that up with the person who had sold it to him. Then he said that Immerich Salo was free to leave whenever he liked, that no Kovar hand would be raised against him at any time in the future, and that this protection extended to the front gate and not one step past it. Sarkis stood up and buttoned his coat and said that he was obliged. I did not watch Emmerich leave. I have been asked about that more than once, and the answer is that I was looking at the floor and that I was thinking about a plate of food in a warm office on a Christmas afternoon, and that I have not been able to smell a cigar since. Nobody in that room ever told me what happened after the gate. I did not ask. That is the part of this life I have never been able to make clean, and I will not pretend to you that I tried very hard. Linnea came to the house that evening and stood in the middle of the gallery with her coat still on, and announced to nobody in particular that she was no longer engaged and that it was the shortest and most successful engagement in the history of the city, and that she intended to be insufferable about it until at least the new year. Her father sent Adriel a bottle of something old with a note that said only, "Next time, ask me first," which I have always thought was the most restrained sentence ever written by a man who had spent 4 hours saying no. The war did not come. It turns out that a Northern house, which has just spent a fortune on worthless paper and lost the man who sold it to them, has a difficult autumn, and by the time the winter contracts came round, Vaso Sarkis was negotiating for the Northern route in the ordinary way, like a man, and getting a worse rate than he would have got in the spring. I know, because I set the rate. That was 6 days later, in the study, and I had the tariff schedule out and a pen in my hand when Adriel took the pen out of my hand and put it on the far side of the desk. 2 weeks, he said. I have 4 accounts that collapse inside a month, if nobody understands the rotation. I have read your handover schedule, he said. It is 11 pages long. It is the most thorough document anybody has ever produced in this house. And Perrin says, if you do a 14-hour day this week, she is going to admit you somewhere with a view. You read my handover schedule. I read it 4 times, he said slowly, out loud. He put a folder on the desk in front of me. It was not a cheap one. Inside, it was an amendment to the founding paper, drawn properly, dated that morning, with a witness line that was not blank. It restructured the signing authority of the Kovar interest, and it named a second signature, and the second signature was mine. not a wife, not a fiancé. There was no ring anywhere in that folder, and there was not going to be one for a very long time. And both of us understood that a great deal of what had happened to us in that cellar was going to need years rather than a gesture. It named me as the second authority on every piece of paper the family holds. I looked at it for a long time. A name on paper, I said, is a name somebody can look up. Yes, Adriel said. That is the point. I am extremely tired of you being the only person in this organization who can be walked around. He came round the desk and crouched down so he was not above me, which he had started doing that week, and never really stopped. I am not going to ask you for anything else, he said. Not this year, possibly not next year. You have spent 6 years paying off a debt that was never yours and living in a cold room to do it, and I will not walk into the space that leaves and call it a rescue. But your name goes on the paper, and everybody who comes into this house from now on is going to have to get past you, because that is what you have actually been for 6 years, and I would like it written down. I picked up the pen. Then I stopped, and I reached over, and I took my phone out of my coat pocket, and I found the photograph Linnea had sent me at midnight on the 22nd, the cream menu card, the handwriting, the 4 words underneath. They want an answer. I turned it around so he could see it. Tell her the wildflowers, I said. The imported stock was a robbery, and I am not signing off on it. Adriel Kovar laughed out loud, which almost nobody in that city has ever heard, and I signed my name. I used the initial. It takes less time. She did not get a proposal, and she did not get rescued, and she did not stop working. Which is the part everybody forgets. What Cassia Merrow got was her name on the founding paper of a family that had spent 6 years walking past her desk, and a man who finally understood that the person keeping his books had been keeping him alive. If you loved this one, the slow burn, the quiet ones, who turn out to be holding everything, then subscribe, because there is more where this came from. And tell me in the comments what you would have done, standing behind that door. Would you have walked in and said something? Or would you have gone back to your desk and finished the reconciliation like Cassia did? I read every one of them.